Rome once seemed almost indestructible. Its roads crossed continents, its armies guarded vast borders, and its laws and institutions maintained a massive political world. The eternal city itself stood as living proof that human civilization could conquer time. Yet even this world eventually began to fracture. In 410 CE, the Visigoths entered and sacked Rome. Although the Western Roman Empire would drag on for several more decades, this event dealt a massive spiritual shock to the entire Mediterranean world. If even Rome could fail, if the strongest armies, the most perfect laws, and the most magnificent cities must eventually crumble into dust, then where could humanity find something that truly never perishes? This question marked a momentous turn in the history of Western thought. Ancient Greek philosophers had spent centuries asking what the cosmos is made of, what is real, what is just, and how one should live. But Christianity introduced a completely different picture of the world. Here, the universe was no longer just an eternally running natural order, but a world created by God. And history was no longer a mere cycle of imperial rise and fall, but a linear journey with a clear beginning, direction, and end. Creation, fall, redemption, and ultimate completion. Consequently, the questions of philosophy began to shift. Humans stopped asking simply, what is the cosmos, and began to ask, why does the cosmos exist? They stopped asking simply, what is the human soul, and began to ask, why does the human soul long for something eternal? Yet, this encounter between Greek philosophy and Christianity was far from a peaceful handover. It was an intellectual duel that lasted for centuries. A famous question came from the early Latin father Tertullian: what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Athens represented Greek philosophy, reason, and the academy. Jerusalem, however, represented the scriptures, revelation, and faith. In Tertullian's view, since God had already given humanity the ultimate truth through revelation, why did we need philosophers who did nothing but argue with one another? By what right could narrow human intellect attempt to measure the infinite God? To completely safeguard the absolute authority of revelation, this passionate Latin apologist even asserted when discussing Christ's death and resurrection, saying, "I believe because it is absurd." His logic was uncompromising. Human reason is simply too narrow to contain the vast ocean of God's mystery. The more impossible and absurd a divine event seemed to human intellect, the more it proved the limitations of reason and the transcendence of faith. Another famous Latin father, Lactantius, also took up a critical pen. In his Divine Institutes, Greek philosophers were systematically brought into account. Even Socrates, revered by the pagan world as the ultimate model of virtue, could not escape his sharp tongue. Lactantius mocked Socrates. If he was indeed the wisest of men, why was he on his deathbed so anxious to remind his friend to sacrifice a chicken to Asclepius, the god of medicine? In the eyes of the church father, this stubborn devotion to low pagan superstition was the ultimate proof of how the so-called false wisdom collapsed into vanity and folly. Under this fierce stance, a powerful voice echoed within early Christianity. Faith has no need for philosophy's stamp of approval. But another group of Christian thinkers chose a completely different path. Rather than banishing Athens from Jerusalem, they sought to bring them together. In Alexandria, the Jewish thinker Philo and later Christian writers like Clement discovered that Greek philosophy actually provided an incredibly powerful set of conceptual tools. To borrow this pagan wisdom with a clean conscience, they even invented a highly witty borrowing theory. Philo and Clement claimed that Pythagoras, Socrates, and especially Plato obtained their deep insights into God and the good precisely because they had secretly read and plagiarized the books of Moses. In their eyes, Plato, the author of the Republic, was essentially nothing more than Moses speaking Greek. While this plagiarism charge resembles a bold academic stretch today, it successfully opened the door for Greek philosophy to merge into Christian theology. Clement and his peers were delighted to find that Plato's dualistic worldview, the eternal, unchanging world of forms versus the physical world as its imperfect shadow, was an almost perfect philosophical replication of the heavenly kingdom versus the earthly realm. Thus, rather than destroying Greek philosophy, Christianity began to absorb it. Philosophy provided the concepts, logic, and methods of argument, while faith provided the revelation of creation, redemption, and God. The relationship between Athens and Jerusalem shifted from pure hostility to a long, complex synthesis. The figure who pushed this grand transition to its absolute peak was Augustine, one of the most legendary minds in Western intellectual history. His era stood on the precipice of classical disintegration with barbarian armies at the gates, and his own life mirrored the conflicts of his age. Before his conversion, Augustine was a young man running wild in pursuit of worldly desires and secular fame. Yet, his heart suffered a tortuous spiritual tear. Caught in a tug-of-war between spirit and flesh, he left behind a deeply human and profound honest prayer in his confessions. "Lord, give me chastity and continence, just not yet." Behind this famous quote lies a profound philosophical revolution. In the ancient Greek tradition, particularly with Socrates, wrongdoing was equated with ignorance. If a person only had knowledge of the good, they would naturally do good. But Augustine proved through his own bodily torment that this rational optimism was wishful thinking. A human being can see the good with absolute clarity, yet completely lack the strength of will to choose it. This is what Augustine discovered as the divided will. The evil in the will is the true source of sin. With this, the spotlight of philosophy was forcefully pulled away from the grand cosmic order and directed deep into the human soul, a place of inner conflict and endless abyss. In 386 CE, in a garden in Milan, the agonizing Augustine heard a child's voice from a neighboring house singing over and over, "Pick up and read, pick up and read." He opened the Bible, and the very first passage his eyes landed on instantly ended his hesitation, choosing the chapter on his profligate youth. When Rome was sacked in 410 CE, prompting pagans to argue that abandoning the ancient gods for Christianity had invited divine wrath, Augustine, now a bishop, penned his monumental masterpiece, The City of God. In this work, he reconstructed human history. Augustine proposed that what truly mattered was not whether any particular empire lasted forever, for all political systems must eventually decay. He explained history through two cities: the earthly city, built on the love of self, power, and worldly desires, and the heavenly city, built on the love of God as its ultimate direction. The fall of Rome no longer meant that the world had lost its meaning. On the contrary, it proved a deeper point, that any political empire or city built by human hands must never be mistaken for eternal. The ultimate order of reality does not depend on any earthly institution. And with this, the Middle Ages began. This was no longer by any means a dark age, barren of thought. Rather, it was a grand intellectual endeavor to find harmony between faith and reason. In the centuries following the collapse of Rome, Western Europe lost most of Aristotle's works amid constant warfare, and philosophy retreated into the dim candlelight of monasteries. Yet, by the 12th century, Aristotle's texts began to flood back into Europe through Arabic translations, triggering an intellectual earthquake. Aristotle's massive, rigorous, and observation-based rational system clashed head-on with the divine revelation of Christian faith. Centuries later, Thomas Aquinas discovered the ultimate system of synthesis. He argued that reason and faith are not enemies. Human reason is capable of studying nature and obtaining true knowledge, while revelation provides the ultimate truths that reason alone cannot reach. Thus, the ancient questions of philosophy were cast into new molds through this thousand-year intellectual experiment. The Greeks asked how the world is put together. Christian philosophy further asked, why does a world exist at all? The Greeks asked, what is the soul? And Christian philosophy began to ask, why does the soul long for eternity? So we can sum this up. Greek thought typically asked for what is something. Christianity thought, Christian, prompted why. So these are the two big differences. Rome will eventually fall into ruins, empires will collapse, and cities will disappear. But it is precisely when the external world becomes unreliable that philosophy turns its gaze to a realm far more hidden and vast than any empire, the inner self. For even as the external world changes, we still retain the ability to remember a past that no longer exists, experience a present that is fading, and anticipate a future that is yet to arrive. So a new question arises. Where does time actually exist? Is it in the external world, or is it within our own consciousness?